Okay, well, we ought to get going here. One thing I should mention to you is, um, this is performance engineering for MBAs. To tell you a little bit about where this came from, I've been wanting to get performance improvement into business schools for a really long time. And, I was trained as a behavior scientist originally with Dr. B.F. Skinner back in the 70s. So I've been doing work now for about 50 years. And I've worked in a lot of large companies all over the world, in Korea and North America and Europe and so forth. And what I've found is that a lot of leaders and managers could benefit a lot from science based performance engineering or performance improvement. But as I've spoken with a few deans of business schools and I've looked at faculty members, what I've noticed is that there's a lot of different approaches to kind of human performance, performance management, and so forth, but they're not the kind of science based approaches truly that I came up through. And I can see a few of my colleagues here whose names I recognize who are from that field, Roger Addison, most notably. But what I've noticed is that in the work that I do, when I turn executives on to the plain English framework for doing performance improvement that we have, they like it and they get into it. So this is kind of a pitch for people in business and ideally people in business schools to begin to learn this stuff. Now, as many of you know, this will be posted eventually on YouTube. And our URL for our YouTube channel, which is called Performance Improvement Insights, is performancethinking.tv. So it's very easy to find. Um, and one of the things, if you're watching the recording rather than watching it live now, please, as content providers or content creators always say, please subscribe, like, and share, because we'd really like to get the word out. Next month, we're really looking forward to it. We're going to have a session with Sarah Anderson from Insperity, which some of you may know is essentially an outsourced HR organization. They're the HR solutions company, and they work with small and medium-sized companies. And Sarah's a senior performance consultant, and they've adopted our brand, Performance Thinking, of performance improvement 15 years ago. And they have a community of practice there that they've had for some years. And what we wanted to talk a little bit about was, sort of how they've supported that and how they've, how when you're creating and supporting a community of practice, what do you got to do to make it really work? So that's what we'll be talking about next week or next month, and I'm really excited about that. We also have our open practitioner program, which is where we teach people from soup to nuts how to do accomplishment-based performance improvement. And we certify people based on a project to actually a real project where they analyze and then come up with a set of solutions to address some performance opportunity. And it could be any number of things. But if you want to know more about that, that QR code will take you to probably more information than you ever would want to know. So today, and I might go a little bit over an hour. I'm going to try to keep it to an hour, but because it's recorded, if you have to drop off at the hour and I'm still going, you can always see the end when it gets to YouTube. But I want to just talk a little bit, and this is superficial. I've only talked to a few deans and looked at curriculum at a few of the top business schools, but how do business schools typically address topics related to people, human performance? And then how performance engineering, which is one phrase we can use for this work, can help drive business results. And then I want to introduce you to performance thinking, which is some of you, I recognize your names here, but some of you know about it, but some of you don't. I see some new names as well. And what we've done is taken what is frankly pretty complicated stuff and is understandably used mostly by us performance improvement nerds. And we've put it in a form with plain English and some simple models that literally anybody can engage. And that goes all the way from senior executives who we've worked with in big companies, all the way down to frontline high school educated people in lean process improvement environments and manufacturing and so forth. So I want to introduce you to performance thinking and then talk about at the end possible curriculum sequence for business schools and then some key takeaways. So these are the kinds of topics that if you look across curriculum in business schools, especially MBA programs, but also undergraduate business schools, These are the kinds of words and phrases that describe what they do. They talk about leadership and organizational performance, and depending on the professor's favorite books and so forth, they address that in different ways. And they often do team-based projects, so they actually do some hands-on work. And there may be leadership labs or simulations. There may be a focus on emotional intelligence so that, in the human context, we aren't just automatons and we can actually work with people with some emotional intelligence. They often include some level of coaching or assessment of leadership or management skills. They work with peer feedback. These are all topics that are covered in different ways. And when I looked at some of the top business schools and I looked at some of the course names, this is a classic. This is literally pulled from curriculum in some of these schools. It may be a few years out of date, so some of them may be changed. But this is some examples: people analytics, managing organizational change, leading organizational lab, system dynamics, et cetera. And you can read those topics. So these are all good. There's nothing wrong with any of these topics. The real question, to me at least, has always been kind of what's behind them, what's actually the content. And I think that varies quite a lot depending on the professors and their backgrounds. Now, if you boil it down, these are some of the common themes. These days, people talk a lot about behavioral economics in terms of how people distribute their behavior and how sort of, behavior, the economics of essentially of consequences of motivation are affected. And then that often involves or is connected to, or maybe is disconnected to, conversations about various psychological models, motivational models, and so forth. Surely, good leadership and management programs talk about systems thinking, and sometimes they go into some depth in organizational design, often as an option. One of the things I've noticed is when I look at B school majors and areas of expertise, there's a lot of these topics that we're covering here, which are kind of optional, and I think they're often used by people who think they're going to be senior HR managers or that sort of thing. And then, of course, human capital means a lot to a lot of people, and talent strategy. So these are some of the core themes. But what I've noticed is that as I look at these and how they're described in the syllabi and so forth, there's a lot of jargon in them, and it depends on what books you've read recently. And a lot of times it's pretty complicated. And so my question is, if you finish an MBA program, be it an executive one or one, right out of undergraduate or early in your career, what do you come out of it with? What other than a bunch of stuff that you can kind of put together, what do you really learn that you can apply? And so that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit here. Now, I've selected the phrase performance engineering to use what I think many of you know is sometimes called human performance improvement or human performance technology. And I want to talk about how it can help in this issue of enabling leaders and managers to really optimize the contributions of the people that they lead and manage. But there's a caveat there, which is if made usable by stakeholders, and that will perhaps become clearer when I talk a little bit about simplicity in our approach. Now, as a level setting point, our purpose, and when I say our, I mean not just leaders and managers and executives, but I also mean people in the performance improvement business. Our purpose is or ought to be accelerating organizational or business results through the performance of people. So when we're talking about performance improvement, we don't mean of machinery necessarily or of software. We mean of people. How do people become productive, optimally productive, and engaged, and want to stick around because they're happy with their work? So that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish here. Now, to step back and show where this stuff came from, it really evolved from behavior science. And my first teacher in this field back in the early 70s was Dr. Skinner, who some of you may know was called the most influential psychologist of the 20th century, and who basically created a behavior science. He, through his measurement technology, primarily rate of response, but I don't want to get nerdy about it, laid down a framework for originally laboratory science that he did, discovering fundamental principles of behavior that could be defined and measured, and then sort of laying out a framework that was eventually applied by a lot of people. And his primary influence on me really was to show that if we take a natural science approach to our own behavior, we can make a difference. And then there was another person that some of you may be familiar with, Tom Gilbert, the late Tom Gilbert, who was iconoclastic. He he liked to make trouble, sort of, and he was quite a character. But he was a very, very smart man, and he published a book that we'll refer to a little bit later called Human Competence, which was published in 1978 and republished a few times since, and it's still being used, taught in some graduate school. But one of the things that he did, uh, and he was among some colleagues and peers who had the same focus, but he made a really big deal, as you'll see, of focusing on accomplishments, not just behavior. That means the valuable products of behavior, and we'll see why that's important shortly. And then there was Joe Harless, and only a few of you might know about Joe, but he was probably Gilbert's most important protege. And whereas Gilbert's book was really a kind of a philosophy book, Joe Harless took accomplishment based performance improvement and boiled it down to a set of job aids and checklists and a methodology which was replicable, particularly in the analysis of performance, focused on what he called accomplishments. And it was detailed enough so that it could be adopted as it was by large organizations like the Coast Guard or Boeing or various other large companies. And he was a big influence on me and a big friend of mine as well. He always used to say, when he looked at our approach, which, as you'll see, is in a way simpler, he always said, I'm looking at your experiment because the more I job aided it, the more consistent the results. But of course, the fewer people wanted to engage because it was too much detail for them. And then finally, Ogden Lindsley, who only a few of you probably know. But Ogden was actually a major, major behavior scientist, and he was himself a doctoral student in the 50s with B.F. Skinner. And he brought into education and clinical work Skinner's measurement, created a charting system for making decisions about individual students or clinical clients. But he also made a big emphasis. If you're going to move, as he did, from Harvard Medical School, basic research, very academic, where people use a lot of technical jargon and are kind of nerdy, into education, as he did in the late 60s, then you got to use plain English. You can't assume that people know the nerdy language, and that had a big effect on me. He also is somebody who, after I was involved with educational work for about 10 or 15 years, kind of kicked me into business in the late 70s, early 80s. He said, you need to take what we've learned and apply it into business. So these were all important contributors coming from behavior science. And if you look at this model, which is one of many, but I show it because it's kind of the well-defined and often shared model from the International Society of Performance Improvement, ISPI. And there's a few people here, especially Roger Addison, who I see on the list, who contributed to all of this. This was an effort by ISPI to take sort of everything you can do around developing performance and put it in one picture. And it's kind of, you can think of it as a collection of methods and tools, or at least that's what I've always thought of it as. And this was called the Human Performance Technology Model, or HPT. So if you looked up HPT, you'd probably find this and a lot of literature about it. Now, when I first encountered this, I thought it was great, but the problem was I would go into client organizations and I'd often see, I remember, for example, Children's Hospital a long time ago, I went into Children's and I was working with the training and development group, and they had that model up on the wall. And the head of the department was saying, we've been trying to do this, but it's kind of complicated. And if leaders come by and look at it, they say, how long is this going to take? This looks like analysis paralysis. So there was kind of a barrier. And the barrier was that the complexity and the jargon of it, brilliant as they might have been from a science and engineering perspective, got in the way of applying and using it. So what I came out of in those days, and this was back in the 80s really, is that we clearly needed some elements to an approach to performance engineering, which first of all, of course, was the systems thinking approach, which looked at all the factors that affect performance, not just skills and knowledge, but all of it. Secondly, it needed to be flexible. It couldn't just be for process improvement. It couldn't just be for talent development. It couldn't just be for one thing. Much like Skinner's behavior science, it had to be a general framework that could actually be applied to kind of anything that involved human performance. And then the third thing, and this is, of course, what I took from Lindsley, was this notion that if we're going to work with managers, leaders, stakeholders of all kinds who are not kind of don't have a background in so-called human performance technology, we got to have some plain language. We can't throw around our jargon. And finally, in order to make it digestible and usable, we had to make it simple without being simplistic. And what I mean by that is we need to be able to take all that stuff that you just saw in a picture and countless other models, and you needed to have a framework which was easy to understand, but was a lot simpler visually, but everything could be included in whatever the simple framework was. And it also, of course, has to be actionable. It can't just be theoretical. It can't just be a concept. Now, when I was first encountering this stuff in the late 70s, early 80s, Steve Jobs was a big influence on me. And Ogden Lindsley, one of the fellows whose picture I showed you a few minutes ago, was a major mentor of mine. And he was an early adopter of the Apple II computer when it first came out. And then, of course, when the Macintosh came out, he definitely went for that. And I moved from MS-DOS to Macintosh in 1986. And I've been working in corporations, but I find that it wasn't a big problem, frankly, to share Microsoft Word or Excel files, etc. But Steve had a big emphasis on simplicity. And if you read stories about him and about how things ran, especially when he was at Apple, everything had to go through the screen of Steve Jobs. And he said more than once that his most important job was to say no. And there's this great book that I quote a lot, but it's called Insanely Simple: The Obsession That Drives Apple's Success by Ken Segall. And it came out quite a few years ago. But there's this great quotation in it from my perspective, because when I first read it, I thought, oh my God, that's what we've been sort of trying to do in performance improvement. And he says, when you start looking at a problem, and it seems really simple with all these simple solutions, you don't really understand the complexity of the problem. And then you get into the problem and you see it's really complicated. That is performance in organizations. And you come up with all these convoluted solutions. And that's sort of the middle. And it's where most people stop, and the solutions tend to work for a while. As a footnote, I would say a lot of those words and phrases and fields that I showed in the earlier slides, to me, are like that. There's sort of a whole lot of stuff that sort of comes together. But Steve continues. He says, you can keep on going and find the key underlying principle of the problem and come up with a beautiful, elegant solution that works. Now, B.F. Skinner's work was also an inspiration in this regard, because in the end, he had a fairly crisp, clear understanding of behavior and how we can analyze it from a scientific point of view without a lot of theoretical baggage. But this was an inspiring quotation to me and concept. And so it sort of led to what has become the work that I've been doing for about 35 or 40 years, which was to create an approach to performance improvement that, first of all, enabled you to analyze and communicate about human performance with an emphasis on communicate, because we got to partner with people in actionable, evidence-based ways. And that's what all the methodologies are attempting to do. But what I think is different, as you'll see about what we do, with simple visual models in plain language, so that people can grok it, so they can actually get their hands around it, so they can understand it, as opposed to being overwhelmed by it. And also, it needs to apply across all levels and functions in the organization. It can't just be for the individual or processes or whole organization. It has to be something that's adaptable at any level. And ideally, if you're trying to build cultures in your organizations, it needs to support the building of communities of shared practice, formal or informal. It needs to have a management culture where people all kind of think the same way about performance in ways that are actionable. Because what we really want is collaboration and continuous improvement. So to me, that's the vision. That's what I started to discover, really, in the mid 80s. And what I would argue, and the thing that we came up with, as you'll see, we call performance thinking, and that name actually came from our clients. Because what you'll see is that we, people would say, you have a method here and some tools, but what you're really teaching us to do is to think differently about performance. And going back to the topic of this webinar, which is performance improvement for MBAs, that's what I'd like business people to be doing, to be looking at the world through a systemic view of the performance of their people, individuals, teams, processes, the whole organization. So they think differently in a way that is generative. So what I would argue is that any approach to performance improvement of any kind, you got to have answers, crisp, clear answers to these three questions. First of all, what is human performance? How do we define it? What are its elements? We can't just, if I ask you all to tell me what you thought it was, you'd all come up with a whole bunch of good words, results and behavior and outcomes and all the rest of it. But until we have a shared sense of what are the elements of it, what is performance in its kind of anatomy, we're not going to be able to communicate or make much progress, in my view. Secondly, once we know that, then we ask the question, what influences human performance? And, depending on the standard line, I would say, but depending on what workshop or book you've read recently, or, Harvard Business Review article, this is a really long list of stuff that influences performance, because people are always talking about techniques and methods and strategies that have names. But once we figure out what a model is, a framework that can incorporate all those influences, then what do we do with it? How do we manage and improve performance? So let me step you through this, because what I want to show you is kind of the elements of a approach to performance, which, at least in my experience, works. So first of all, what is it? What is human performance? This is where Tom Gilbert comes up, and again, many of you in this group, I think, know who about Tom Gilbert. But he said in this book of his, Human Competence, that was published in '78 and is still taught in graduate schools, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. We must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, this is a shift, an enormous shift. Because if you think about leaders and managers, when they're talking about people performance, they often talk about their behavior. If people are giving feedback, they think about it as about the person's behavior. If they think about somebody who's doing well, they try to capture their behavior, or somebody who's a problem. And so it's not just behaviorists or trainers, it's kind of everybody, is what Tom was talking about. And what he said is, in the world of work, in organizations where results matter, we can't just talk about behavior, because behavior is costly. We want to talk about its valuable products. And I coined the term work outputs some years ago. And the reason I did that was because a lot of people who talk about this work use the word accomplishments, but they use it in pretty different ways. So some people talk about what I would think of as big aggregate business results, like profit or customer satisfaction. I don't think of that as an accomplishment. I think of that as a business result to which an accomplishment contributes. Some people talk about small bits. I didn't want to argue with my colleagues about the meaning of the word accomplishments. So in terms of training people and developing people that we work with, we coined this phrase work outputs, because first of all, it's the product of something, work, in a work environment. And secondly, notice it's plural. So we can count them. They are things. They may not be always tangible things. They often are tangible, like documents or deliverables, widgets of some kind. But sometimes they're things like recommendations or feedbacks or ideas or relationships. And those are all things that, even if they're not physical, we can define them. We can say when they're good and when they're not good, and we can count them, which is kind of important. So that's the floor that really Tom laid down. And out of that, we developed this very simple picture called the performance chain. And we anchor the analysis and design to work outputs, as you see in the yellow box. So if we're starting any project or any coaching conversation or any kind of effort to formally or informally address some human performance thing, we surely want to start with the end in mind. We want to talk about business results, like what's at stake here. Is this about productivity or employee engagement or safety or customer satisfaction or productivity? What is it? And once we're kind of clear on that, then we want to look at the performance of the individual, of the team, of the process, And we want to say, what are the work outputs here? And those words below work outputs are not really a taxonomy. They're types of work outputs where we find that language helps identify things. For example, thinking of MBA type folks or senior leaders and managers, decisions are among the most important products of leaders and managers' behavior. But they don't always think of those as accomplishments or work outputs. They often think of them as behavior. But as you well know, a funding decision, a hiring decision, a product prototype approval, whatever it is, those are enormously impactful things that deliver value if they're good ones. Once we know what the outputs are, then we can look at behavior influences. But this is the core model, the performance chain. This is how we define the elements of performance. And it goes from left to right. Behavior influences, all that stuff affects behavior in some way, might get in the way, might support it, but ideally it supports it so that the behavior produces work outputs, and we define what good work outputs are with criteria. And if they're good ones, they're valuable to the extent they contribute to business results. But we, of course, analyze it with the end in mind. So that's our first model. It's just 4 things labeled with those words. Now, Tom, actually, I just realized I meant to upload a revised version of this slide, so I'm kind of screwed up here. But the original Tom Gilbert thing said worth of an intervention equals the value of the accomplishments divided by the cost of behavior. Now, current days, that would be thought of as return on investment or ROI. So if you think about some intervention to help people perform better, or a process or an organization, a team, whatever, the classic thing is you pull the training lever, right? The old, okay, they're not performing well, so we ought to train them. It's like when we see people being murdered by policemen, and you see videos or news items where the mayor or the chief of police says, we're going to retrain our policemen. And I just don't quite think that's necessarily going to be the most cost-effective intervention. Might be part of it, but there's probably some other stuff. And so what we want to do is we want to arrange things to support the behavior, which will be costly, in order to produce accomplishments. So a classic example of a return on investment is, a lot of times if you look at some performance, you say, well, we don't have to take people off the job and produce a whole training design of some kind. We can give them a good checklist or a job aid, and then set some expectations and provide feedback. And the intervention will be a lot less expensive, and we may produce the same or greater level of accomplishments or outputs. So ideally, if we're coming at it from a leaders and managers sort of MBA perspective, this is what we're trying to do: arrange conditions to ensure that people are productive at optimal cost. Now, we can look for accomplishments at multiple levels. We can look at, this is called an organizational relationship map, and some of you are probably familiar with this. This happens to be of a behavioral health organization years ago, and it's not even complete. And you don't have to be able to read it, but for this purpose right now. But everything within the gray box is the organization itself. And then the things outside the gray box are suppliers, customers, regulatory agencies, the board, and so forth. But you see those arrows going around in there, and those arrows are passing around valuable things: data sets, decisions, approvals, widgets, whatever they are, plans, forms. And so you can start at an organizational level and drill down to find accomplishments. That's not usually what I get to do, because I'm usually working with Fortune sort of global 500 or big companies. So I don't get to usually work with the whole company, but you can do that if it's a smaller company quite easily. This is a more common framework, a process. And this is a really simple process. And those of you who know about process work probably recognize this as a so-called swim lane diagram, where you have 3 performers: the author of a content specification document, the editor of it, and the person who approves it. And so you can see in the boxes there are behavior, but in the orange circles or ovals there are outputs. So in a process, each step ought to produce a valuable thing that gets passed on to the next step. Not everybody analyzes processes in this way. In fact, I've worked with some pretty sophisticated Six Sigma and Lean people, and they are really crisp about the final output, but they're not always all that well defined about the outputs of each step. So this is where you'd find outputs in a process. And then this is what we call an individual performance map, a tool that we've been using for years and sort of refined and revised. This happens to be a chief learning officer in a new job at a bank, and he was hired to sort of drive digital transformation. And so the performer is in the middle, and his customers, so-called, or the recipients of his outputs, are around the side. The CEO himself, he needs to produce things like a list or a appointment book or whatever. The company as a whole, et cetera. You can see the customers, and all those things that are bulleted are outputs. And this is a pretty complete description of this person's job. So we can look for outputs for individuals, and I'll show you a little bit more about how we do that later. Now, one of the things about outputs is that they really connect people up to organizational results. Because if you tell a person that's working for you, or a team that you head up, or you're the VP and you show up at the regional office and you're giving a talk to people, or you're speaking with people, whatever it is, in a leadership or management role especially, and people don't feel that connected to the organization, especially if they're doing stuff like filling out forms frequently, or doing stuff which to them seem like little diddly, not very important things. And you can tell them, you can speak all day about their behavior. Just like with a salesperson, you can say, well, you ought to make a lot of phone calls. Well, okay, but why do we care? Well, because that's the way you get appointments. And that little form that you fill out a whole lot of times after each call you have from a customer actually can contribute to customer satisfaction, because if they call in again or talk to some other customer service rep, that CSR ought to be able to read your note and know in detail quickly what you talked with the person about, so that they can then serve the person. So work outputs, the products of behavior, are valuable to the extent they contribute to business results. And if you highlight that for people rather than just their behavior, they get it and they like it usually. It's also the case that when we use the performance chain, measurement is pretty straightforward, because we know we can measure organizational results, profits, customer satisfaction, market share, safety, et cetera. Those tend to be lagging indicators. We don't have enough data to make frequent decisions, but we got to monitor that stuff. Of course, we can measure behavior. We can watch people do stuff. We can have a checklist. In some environments, like a safety environment, or an environment where you have to follow the procedures precisely, like in a biotech factory or in a nuclear plant, you can monitor behavior. There's no doubt about it. It's fairly expensive, but you can do that. And it's a good way to diagnose and provide feedback around things where there's some problem. But the big deal is, and most people are not that clear about this, except maybe in manufacturing environments, is we can also count work outputs, good ones and not so good ones. So decisions, widgets, session notes, recommendations, prototype products, whatever the products of behavior are, we can count and measure those. So we sort of have measurement covered in a relatively simple way. And one of the things I've noticed among people with business backgrounds, MBAs and such, understandably, they're into their OKRs and their KPIs, all their measures. And that's beautiful. But one of the things about it is those things are going to sort into these three categories. So this framework, the performance chain, simplifies, not by eliminating stuff, but by categorizing, chunking, and labeling things. So we can measure these. These are just examples of different things we can measure. There's a publication that I put out about work in customer call center that you can get to if you want to use that QR code. So that's the first thing. What is human performance? It's behavior that produces accomplishments that are valuable to the extent they contribute to organizational business results. So then the second question is, I sort of skipped that slide. All right, so now what influences behavior? So we go back to B.F. Skinner with this, because with Skinner, he had this laboratory framework that came from work mostly with non-humans, which by behavior is often called the three-term contingency. And this is the slightly nerdy version, but it's a discriminative stimuli, SD, sets the occasion for a response, which hopefully results in a reinforcing stimulus, although it could result in a punishing stimulus. So this was his idea, and this is what a lot of people in the organizational behavior management world and in the applied behavior analysis world have used to think about how to influence performance. But as Tom Gilbert recognized, it's a little more complicated than that with humans in human environments, in work environments. Because first of all, that second category, instruments, in the lab, we created keys or PECs or buttons or whatever to make it easy, usually, for the behavior, the performer, to respond. But in a lot of work environments, as you well know, the tools, the processes, the work designs, the software may not be so good. So we need to call that out as a huge opportunity to improve performance. Sometimes if you give people a well-designed, user-tested checklist, it can make an enormous impact. So unless we categorize that as its own thing, we're missing something. And then he used the words incentives to talk about consequences, motivating consequences, even though there are also consequences that are unexpected, sometimes unintended negative ones, or sometimes just the natural payoff for doing something well. So that word was a little tricky because it sounds like something you know about in advance. And then knowledge, the thing that he distinguished was between what the environment provides you and what the person needs or brings to the table. So the person needs knowledge. We either provide it through training and documentation, reference materials, or we hire people based on their already having that knowledge. And you could probably argue that skills ought to go into that cell too. And then capacity was Gilbert's word for fitting a person to the job. Do you have the capacity to be a dock worker, to be an analyst, to be a salesperson? What are your characteristics? What skills do you have? What are your values? What are all the things that come together to make you a good fit for whatever the task or job is? And then finally, motives was really Gilbert's way of talking about how Skinner defined consequences. That is, a consequence, something that comes after behavior, Skinner would only call a reinforcer if it actually increased behavior. That is, if it actually was a positive consequence for the person or the organism. And so if we can identify people's motives, it makes it a lot more likely that we will come up with incentives that actually motivate them to do stuff. But there's also in that category values of the organization, because organizations have values depending on their business they're in, and aligning with those are also important. So this is a beautiful model, and many people in this group know about it. I learned about it in like the very early 80s when I first met Tom Gilbert, and it was powerful. And I was working with my colleagues, teams of consultants, and we would say, wait a minute, it's just not a knowledge thing. We have to provide data that sets expectations and all that. But what we found was, even though we love this, what we found was that a lot of our clients had trouble with the language. Like data, like what is that? Is that spreadsheets? What is that? Or instruments, et cetera. Those words did not grab them, and they made a lot of category errors. So I started in the mid 80s, like a lot of my colleagues did. I think I took another step, though, by user testing it a lot. I started tweaking that language. And the intention was to come up with language for those cells which identified what was in the cell crisply and clearly, but was plain English. So there would be no need for translation or nerdy definitions. And so this is what we came up with in the late 80s. And then in 1991, one of my clients, Tom Hogan at Dun & Bradstreet, when I was up in the front of the room with a bunch of the folks that work for him, he's a senior vice president of sales training, or vice president of sales training, actually, had been a sales guy before that. And he, I was stumbling. I said, well, this is like Tom Gilbert's model, but you can see the words are different and all that. And he said, why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? You always talk about those boxes. So Tom Hogan named the model and we trademarked it eventually. But this is the language that we use. It's only 6 categories. People learn about what goes in each of those categories very quickly. They can use it in a diagnostic way. They can use it in a design way, et cetera. And if you want more, there's a whole webinar we did last year, I think, on sort of in detail about this model. But this is the framework that we use to answer the question, what influences behavior? And this is a small thing because it was only a small group, but few years ago at the International Society for Performance Improvement annual conference, one of my colleagues, unbeknownst to me, had a session in which they nominated and then voted for the best performance model in the world. And the 6 boxes model won, which is not that big a deal, but I think it reflects the fact that people found it useful. Now, an important thing about this is it's not just 6 categories or 6 lists. We could go through the exercise, and I think I do in that webinar I just pointed you to, but to show how these things are all completely interactive with one another. They're all linked to one another. It is a system. And what I would argue is that there is no factor in any human performance system that does not either fit into one of these cells or is involved in connections between them. For example, one of the cool ones I think is the word trust. What does the word trust mean? Well, what it typically means is that if I set expectations and I provide you the tools and resources you need to be successful, and then when you are, I say, good job, or with the equivalent, you begin to trust my guidance and my leadership and so forth. But if I set expectations for you to accomplish something and you knock yourself out, and then all of a sudden I pull the rug out from under by changing it or by removing resources or by not giving you the resources, and maybe you're successful having worked on weekends and nights to get it done and nobody notices, pretty soon you come to distrust not just me, your leader, manager, but the whole organization. So to me, that's a kind of an abstract idea of trust that you can actually analyze with this framework. But anything else, what I find is very quickly I can get people to understand what the factors are that influence performance. And it's also important to recognize, if we go back to this notion of return on investment, that beside focusing on valuable accomplishments using the performance chain, and trying to identify the most cost-efficient behavior for producing that. When we support the behavior, we want to combine all of these things as cost-effectively as possible. So instead of just, for example, trying to push something through with a training program, how about if we give people some good reference documentation and job aids, have engage with managers and leaders, which is really who I'm addressing this whole session to set clear expectations and provide fairly frequent feedback, and to arrange recognition or consequences, even if it's just thank you when people are successful. I can probably, by using the top row in a way that fits into my daily life and the life of the organization and the team, I can probably influence people's performance as much or more than if I were just send them to a training program, just as one example. So these things all work together, and being systemic is important. And we can define the elements of the performance system in great detail, and people don't have a hard time learning how to organize these things. Third thing is, how do we analyze and improve performance? Because we've got 2 models now. We know what performance is, we know what influences it. So we use what we call performance improvement logic. And this is something that any manager, any leader can learn pretty rapidly. We say, let's, in any situation, be sure we know what's at stake here. What's the organization's result we're trying to improve or contribute to? And now let's look at the hunk of performance we care about, process, individual, role, whatever it is. Figure out what the work outputs are there and be sure they do contribute to business results. Because if they don't, it's like lean, we get rid of it. We don't need it. Once we got that, it's pretty straightforward then to say, okay, let's observe successful performers. Let's do a task analysis. Let's have our training guys take a look at that in more detail. But we can now define the behavior needed to produce those outputs. And we may be able to discover some of the clever things that our superstars do that we can enable other people to do to produce those outputs. Once we got those, as I mentioned earlier, we can now have possibilities for measuring outcomes and results, what's convenient, what data can we get under what conditions. And then we move to the 6 boxes model, and we do a kind of a little design thinking thing there. We analyze, if it's current performance, what's working in each category. And it's not too hard. You go through that kind of list I showed you a couple of minutes ago, and you can think through, are expectations clear or not? Are they conflicting? How do you get your feedback? What does that look like? How often? Is it positive, mostly critical? What does it look like? How about the tools, resources, processes, et cetera? So you can go through each cell, and you can do this in a really quick and dirty way, or you can also do it in a big, fancy, sophisticated way, but you're analyzing what are the pluses and minuses and gaps in each cell. And now let's brainstorm along with our stakeholders what we might do to improve where things were missing or problematic. And now, again, ideally with our stakeholders, let's choose the behavior influences that we're going to put in place. Let's implement, measure, and adjust as needed. And this is where kind of the agile part comes in, because we don't usually get it completely right. We usually need to check back and say, oh, wait a minute, we missed that one. We better fix it. And that's where continuous improvement kicks in. And if we're a leader or manager, we can begin to share, because there's only 21 plain English words in those two models. We can begin to share these two pictures and the 21 plain English words with our teams, with our departments, with our whole organizations. And in my view, there is no more powerful tool set for a person with an MBA or a business leadership role than this framework. And what we've learned is that anybody can use it. I mentioned this earlier, but we've worked across different departments, up and down levels, from vice presidents and CEOs down to frontline workers. Anybody can learn this. And once they do, it's a shared thing. And you can probably hardly read this, but when we set out to do this stuff 20, whatever it was, years ago, 30 some years ago, what we wanted to be able to do is enable a lot of people to use the same framework. And so you can see on the top there, executive leaders, middle managers, frontline supervisors, et cetera. And then down the left, it may not be the language which each of those people would use to describe what they wanted to do, but every place where there's an X, you can use what I just showed you, the two models and the logic, to improve performance. So it's a highly flexible and applicable thing. And we can, one of the things is that executives need to think about human capital. We know that. But how do they do that? Well, you can drive every stage of talent development, from recruitment through ongoing development with coaching and performance reviews and promotions and so forth. At every level, if we have an individual performance map for that role, we can recruit people by creating good behavior-based, interview questions and possibly performance tests. We can onboard them by being sure they can produce the outputs that they need to produce for their job. We can train them on specific things where the objective is, at the end of this training module, you'll be able to produce X, a decision, a better relationship with your peers, or whatever it is. And then you can move them into an ongoing talent development coaching cycle, which is continuous development of people. And you can do compensation reviews and all the rest of it. So this is a single framework that you can drive all of this with. And there's an article that we published about a year ago now in Talent Development Magazine that lays this out in much more detail, and you can get to that through the QR code. Now, here's an example. This is kind of a cool one. This is from one of our clients in Dubai, working for one of those large oil-funded multi-company, family, like conglomerates. They have like 60 businesses. And this particular person that I was working with, and you can hardly read this, but in all of their companies, some of them retail, some of them manufacturing, different kinds of companies, they all said these leaders need to provide the outputs that are in the blue boxes. No matter what their job is, these are all fundamental things that they had to enable their level 2 leaders to do. And the orange ones are some business results those things are related to. So I thought this was a really cool way that she used the individual performance map to define not just a specific job, but a role that was across a whole bunch of different companies as a foundation for talent development. And then we have a coaching methodology, and perhaps you can understand this. If you sit down with somebody you're coaching, if you're a senior leader and you're working with your VPs, or you're the VP working with your directors, or your director working with your team, whatever it is, and you want to help them continuously develop, and you do some sort of a coaching or mentoring process, if you create an individual performance map, which is easy enough to teach people how to do, you can then say, well, what are we going to work on this week? Let's work on that quarterly report that you're supposed to give to the CEO, and let's tighten that up. Let's talk about that. And so you figure out what a good one is, and you have a conversation using the 6 boxes about what you could do together to improve it, and you go from there. And so for coaching, individual coaching, this is a really, really nice model because it focuses you in on the value that your coachee wants to deliver. And there's a short playlist of videos about that you can get to there. But a discovery we made a few years ago And this is not so much for executives to do as to be the recipient of. We discovered a new uh, addition, if you will, to executive coaching. And this happens to be the executive director of a rather large um, behavioral health company. And what you can see there is that the executive director delivers all of these things to department heads, families, clients, et cetera, et cetera. And these are things like reports and updates, but they're also things like decisions, approvals, budgets, goals. And as a senior leader, a lot of your outputs are actually things more like goals or approvals or decisions that you distribute to your senior team often. Like you're a CEO, let's say, and you got some VPs, you're often delivering those things to them, designed to enable them to perform effectively and better. And one of the things we know as senior leaders and even middle managers is that we can talk about the processes to which these contribute. So this is what we call an extended individual performance map, where once we define the job of the CD, we started to list what are the processes to which they contribute. And if you talk with as in a coaching context over time with that executive, and you start to say, which of those processes are working okay? Are there any of them we should drill into a little bit more detail? You can unpack things to which they make a contribution and that they need to have perform well. You can do the same thing with the folks that report to them. You can talk about the department heads that report to them. Like, how are those decisions and approvals and goals being dealt with by your guys? And it's a way to unpack with the executive director or whoever the senior person is the impact of what they do. And one of the first questions we always ask when we do this, we say, well, okay, that's your whole job, man. So what's the most important stuff? Why don't we circle those? And then you say, what do you spend the most time on? And it's not always the same thing. And you say, oh, well, is there a delegation plan here? So this tool is enormously powerful for sort of optimizing an executive performance. And I stick that in there for fun, really. But that QR code goes to my calendar. So if anybody wants to make an appointment with me for executive coaching, you can go for it. So our stakeholders, the people who've been through this stuff and who worked with us in this stuff, this is just an example, but these are all fairly senior people or people involved with them. Senior VP of sales says, if I can't fit what I'm about to do as an executive or manager to the 6 boxes model, I don't even do it. This model and the understanding I've gained about the factors that drive successful performers are central to my management leadership approach. Or the CEO of a behavioral health company. Performance thinking helped us move from being a struggling company to one with tools to overcome any performance obstacle. I mean, you can read these on your own, but these are each people who either are senior leaders themselves or help them and are pointing out how this framework was very, very helpful to them. And again, coming back to the return on investment thing. In part, what your job as a manager or leader is to do is to optimize conditions so your people will be productive and engaged. When we focus on accomplishments, we're focusing on value. When we use the 6 boxes model, we're optimizing the system. So it's a very compact but powerful tool set. So if there's anybody here who happens to be involved with a business school, here's some logos of some top business schools. But for fun, I put the Albert School, which is from my undergraduate alma mater, Seattle University, which is a really, really good regional business school, relatively small university business school. But anyway, these are some of the top companies. Top business schools. If anybody's watching this, you could definitely take a curriculum sequence over the course of a couple of years with the MBAs, or even a compact version for executive MBA programs. And you could provide a kind of introduction to this that's a little bit what I talk about today, only expanded a bit. You can then have a lab or an application where people begin to apply that to some organizational performance systems issues, whether it's a big process or organizational redesign or whatever it is. You can then focus them in on process improvement and quality and operational efficiency, because Six Sigma and Lean are all very important process improvement methodologies. But what I've learned working with those guys is that we add value. We focus on accomplishments even inside the processes, And the 6 boxes model gives us a way to not just throw stuff into the human error bucket, but to actually do root cause analysis and figure out how to fix the human errors. So that's a really important part for most leaders and managers. And then we can teach people how to manage and coach in much the way that I was pointing to in that coaching example, where we actually help our people by defining their accomplishments, defining what a good one is, and then optimizing conditions, hopefully collaborating with them. And then as possible electives, if you got somebody who wants to focus on talent development, we can do a deep dive into how at each stage of talent development this approach can help. And then we can even maybe have executive coaching for, MBAs. Certainly in an executive MBA type program, you could do a little quick and dirty executive coaching thing with the participants and have them leave with an individual performance map and at least some beginning ideas about how to improve their impact. So a few takeaways. What I think, at least in my superficial observation, is when it comes to human performance, B schools offer a lot of stuff, but often they're kind of conceptual and a whole lot of different angles, and it depends on the textbook, and it's not that straightforward. And sometimes there's some simple stuff like incentive motivation, feedback, emotional intelligence, process improvement. Those are all good things, but that's only a small slice of what people need to understand when it comes to performance. Second thing is they need something that's actionable, easy to communicate, flexible, can be applied in all kinds of ways. And our particular approach to performance engineering is plain English. And it focuses on value and return on investment. So it seems like a good candidate for people in the business world, not just the staff that they have, but the managers and leaders themselves as a way to think about their world and to allocate resources to optimize performance. And so what we've learned is that applications of this over the last 30 years, pick a business result and we've probably helped to improve it. Let's put it that way. And what we find is that it was career changing. We get these testimonials from people who say, oh my gosh, I see things in a different, much more powerful and straightforward way now than I used to. It's not all a big jumble. And so, if you want to get a lot more, you can go to our YouTube channel. So we've only got a few minutes left. I'll stick around if you want. I'm looking in the chat box. Roger says, one of the areas I've seen is the area of implementation gets where many of the recommendations start to go. Yes, Roger, good point. If you're still with us, last month I did a webinar on implementation planning and change management, and I think if I'm getting your point here, is a lot of times sustainment. Implementation implies you're putting some new thing in place and then you're trying to be sure it sustains. And if I'm reading your chat comment about where many of the recommendations start to go downhill, I think what you're saying is that they're not sustained. And I'm reminded of two things. One of them is, and I think Gina Rester-Zadro is with us here today. There she was. Let's see, am I still on the list, Gina? Yes, there you are, Gina. So one of the beautiful contributions that Gina made when she was at Amgen for many years, and she certified, I think, several hundred people in our methodology, and now she's starting over again at a smaller company. But Gina talked about adding S to ADDIEs. ADDIE. And ADDIE is an old acronym that performance and training people use: analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation. And what I recollect from Gina is that they added the sustainment to the end of it, which meant in the beginning of some project, they would get agreement with the stakeholders that once we implement, we're going to check back in some number of weeks or whatever, and we're going to do a quick and dirty 6 boxes analysis, because we're going to find out probably that some of the stuff we thought would work didn't, and we have to change it. And to me, that's one of the major sustainment issues, which is you say, oh, that consequence didn't work. I see you, Gina. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I thought that was a huge thing, because so many people, it's like, okay, one and done, we're on to the next thing, and they don't sustain. So what do anybody think that this, first of all, let me look. There's some attendees whose names I don't know here. Is there anybody here affiliated with a business school? Maybe not, but I would love to have an opportunity to basically introduce this in some sort of seminar way to some folks in an MBA program and see what happens, because I think it would go in pretty easy and they would find it beneficial. Anyway, our hour's up. Key to long-term success with your stakeholders to watch and measure sustainment. Absolutely. Yeah, that's Gina's comment. That's been my observation. There we have some friends that know each other. That's cool. Well, anyway, thank you for your attendance. If anybody wants to add to the chat box or raise a question, I'm happy to stick around. Um, but I hope this was helpful. I know it's the same old story, and a lot of people's names I recognize here have seen this same old story, but you keep coming back, maybe hoping it'll be different. I don't know. It's like they asked Bernie Sanders why he doesn't change his presentation. He says, when the world changes, I'll change my presentation. But with that being said, I hope this was helpful, and it'll be on YouTube and probably by the weekend or so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start identifying deans and others at business schools and see if we can find somebody who's interested in somehow introducing this in their organizations.